Welding with an electrode is a very complicated process, but if you have to weld sheet metal or thin plates, it's going to be much more difficult for you. Did you know there's a way to weld thin sheet metal using two electrodes? By using this method, you'll be able to weld without risking burning through the material. And it's a slightly easier way since sheet metal or thin plates are very difficult to weld. And even more so if we're using a stick welder, because if you weld with too much amperage, you can burn through the material, and if you weld with too little amperage, the electrode sticks or it simply doesn't weld the metal. That's why in this video I'm going to show you these techniques so you can weld thin metal without burning through it. Here in my hand I have this 20 gauge sheet metal which is about 0.9 millimeters thick, and here I have a caliper. So you can see the thickness of this sheet. As you can see, the sheet is 0.9 millimeters thick. For this first technique, we're going to use a 6013 electrode that's 2 millimeters thick. Here in my hand, I have both electrodes so you can see the difference between a 2 millimeter and a 2.5 millimeter electrode. Although ideally, we would use the 2 millimeter electrode, it's not very easy to find. That's why if you have a 2.5 millimeter electrode, you can use it too, but it's a little more difficult. Since I'm going to use the 2 millimeter electrode, I'm going to set the machine to 60 amps. I already have the two plates stacked and ready to weld. Ideally, there shouldn't be any gap between these two sheets, because if there's too much space, that's where it will burn through. For this first technique, we're going to use the stitch welding method. You rest the electrode and lift it quickly when the weld starts to cool down, when the red starts to fade. We move the electrode about 3 or 4 millimeters and make the next stitch. This way, and this is how this stitch welding looks. As you can see, the metal wasn't perforated and it has good penetration, but this process looks ugly aesthetically and it's also very slow to do. Now let's move on to the next technique, which is welding continuously with the electrode. For that, we're going to rest the electrode in the groove, which would be at the joint of the two sheets. And all we're going to do is slide the electrode backward without making any kind of movement. When sliding the electrode, you have to do it at a pretty fast speed, because if you stop or go slow, you're going to pierce the material. For this technique, it's also very important to use the machine at 60 amps with the 6013 electrode of 2 millimeters. As you saw, this second technique leaves an even and neat bead with a very good finish and good penetration. But this technique, even though it's nicer to do, has its disadvantages. And it's the heat. When welding continuously on thin metal, the heat will build up throughout the material. This is a bad thing because when the whole sheet heats up, it will start to contract, it will deform, and it will lose its previous shape or it will bend. Even though this bead is very nice to make, it has those disadvantages that cause deformation. When welding metal, this process is good to use when you have to weld thin profiles. And as you can see, it had very good penetration. Now, to do this last technique, we're going to use two electrodes. We're going to use two 2.5 6013 electrodes. You have to remove all the coating from one of the two electrodes. And we're going to use that electrode to add filler to the sheet, just like in the tungsten inert gas process. For that, we're going to rest the bare electrode in the groove at the joint between the two sheets. And with the other electrode, we're going to weld on top of the other electrode. The tack we're going to make is on the electrode, not on the sheet. To do this technique, we're going to use the machine at 90 amps. Why is this amperage so high? Because now we have to melt the other electrode, and when it melts with the other electrode, it will fuse with the sheet. So we're going to rest the bare electrode on the joint and start stitching on top of the electrode. And this is how the weld looks using two electrodes. As you can see, it's not very aesthetic either, but it's a bit faster than the stitching technique. And it's less risky to pierce the metal since we're applying the heat to the electrode and not directly on the thin metal. This technique is good to use if you don't have experience welding with stitches. Subscribe. As you can see, it has good penetration and stays well attached to the sheet metal. The three techniques I showed you each have their advantages and disadvantages. It's up to each person to decide which technique to use depending on the situation. I usually use all three techniques. The stitch technique for welding thin sheets. I use the continuous welding technique when I have to weld thin PTR profiles, and I use the two electrode welding technique when I have to weld thin sheets and thin PTR profiles. But they have a gap between them. I mean, the joints are not well joined together because besides welding, it also fills the gap. That's why these three techniques are very useful to learn. Did you know about this two electrode welding technique? What do you think? Which technique did you like the most? If you enjoyed this video, please follow me. It really helps.